Okay, so again, thank you everyone for showing up tonight. My name is Linda from the Upper Saddle River Library. I am very happy to have Dr. Bill Thierfelder, who is going to be talking to us about the Grimm tales, all about what's really behind the Brother Grimm's tales, perhaps not the Disney version that most of us are used to.
Exactly.
So with that, I am going to mute myself as well. Like I said before, I will be keeping a view on the chat. I have muted people that have been in here, and there'll be a chance for questions at the end. So I am now going to chat myself and let Bill take it away.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for being here. And welcome to the Upper Saddle River Library presentation called Grimm Tales. My name is Dr. Bill Thierfelder, and I'm going to be your host this evening. For those who don't know me, I'm a retired professor of arts and humanities who currently lives in Portland, Oregon, where I'm a lecturer, a writer, and an artist. I also return to my hometown of New York City once or twice a year to continue my work as a docent at the Museum of Natural History. Now, let me just do this. Yes, because we can't cover everything about today's topic in a 60 or 70 minute or so presentation, I invite you to take a deeper dive on my website, makingwings.net. And you're going to go to deeper dive number 9. Let me explain here. We're going to go to the website. Hopefully you are seeing that. That is my website. And I always joke with me, myself, and I. If you go to the upper right corner, you see what's called a hamburger menu. And if you click on that, what you're going to see is that home page, which tells you a little bit about myself. It also tells you the schedule of library presentations I'm giving, also my program index. I have 93 of them right now. And then some other things, including, if you're really nosy, my resume, so you can find out a lot about me. But for today's presentation, you'll see all these deeper dives. Every program that I give, I try to create a web page that is kind of affiliated with the presentation. And tonight is deeper dive number 9. So you go to, here we go to Grimm Tales. And what you'll find there will be a biographical sketch of the two brothers and some recommended reading. And we're going to go over that in a bit. So, but if you want to copy down titles or things, they're here on the website. And then there are some printed and video web resources that I've put up for you. And tonight yes, I have a timeline. And don't want to make you dizzy here. But then we're going to be looking tonight at 9 of the Grimm Brothers folk tales. And for each of them, I have some background information. I also have the e-text of all 9 of the folk tales. So there's all kinds of good things. And in a little bit, we're going to be talking about what is a myth, a legend, and a folk and a fairy tale. What's the difference among all of those? So all of that is on my webpage. And again, because I include so many other topics in these deeper dives, if you want to go beyond the Grimm Brothers and look at some other topics, please feel free. That's what my website's for, makingwings.net. Now, one of the things that you did see when we went to the website was that you saw some books, and I have found these very useful in my research. Donald Hatinga's The Brothers Grimm, 2 Lives, 1 Legacy. Murray Peppard's Paths Through the Forest, a biography of the Grimm brothers, an excellent one. And Jack Zipes' The Brothers Grimm, From Enchanted Forest to the Modern World. Now, all 3 of these are really excellent introductions to anyone who wants to know more about these men and their revolutionary work. And perhaps your library or other local libraries, interlibrary loan, whatever, might have these books available. Now, on a personal note, when I taught my courses on myths, legends, and folktales at Dowling College, it was a small liberal arts college on Long Island, I used portions of this Jack Zipes book for my classroom presentations, and the students really enjoyed it. So it's a good book. So here's what we're going to be doing this evening. First, we'll look at a few biographical details about the Grimm brothers. And again, if you want a complete biography, again, please visit Deeper Dive number 9, makingwings.net. Then what we're going to do is discuss where the Grimm's work fits in the larger context of myths, legends, and folk tales. And then finally, we're going to, as I said, look at 9 of the 210 folk tales in the Grimm Brothers' major publication that was called Children's and Household Tales. And as I showed you, the complete text for each of these tales, as well as the background information, again, can be found on my website. So why don't we begin with a few words about the brothers themselves. Now, their full biographies are on my website. But let's give you some basic background. Jakob Ludwig Karl Grimm was born first in 1785, and he died in 1863. His brother Wilhelm Karl Grimm was born 1 year after in 1786, but he died 4 years before in 1859. Now, they were extraordinarily close and lived their lives as academics, philologists, cultural researchers, lexicographers, and authors. Together, they collected and published folklore. They traveled throughout Germany and listened to oral versions of stories that had been handed down, sometimes for generations, through families and in villages. And they also unearthed often forgotten written versions of stories as well. And they compiled, I guess, the best of these, or what they thought was the best of these, in their major publication. We'll talk about that in a moment. Now, the brothers were born in the town of Hanau in Hesse-Kassel, which is now in Germany, and spent most of their childhood in the nearby town of Steinau. Now, the map on the upper left shows you that their hometowns, you can see there the little yellow arrow there, right? It shows that their hometowns were near the major city of Frankfurt, Germany. And along the bottom half, you see 3 pictures there of the city of Hanau and Steinau as they look today, including the statue of the Grimm brothers in the Hanau town square, and in this case with a pigeon deciding to roost upon Jakob's head there. Now, their father's death in 1796 impoverished the family and affected the brothers for many years after, both economically and emotionally. They attended, and it's on your screen, the University of Marburg, where they began a lifelong dedication to researching the early history of the German language and German literature, including German folktales. The Philipps University of Marburg, and as I say, you can see that on your screen, was founded in 1527 by Philip I, the Landgrave of Hesse, which makes it, here's a good trivia question for Jeopardy tonight, which makes it one of Germany's oldest universities, and it's the oldest still operating Protestant university in the world. So, in a nutshell, we have 2 brothers who literally lived with each other for their entire lives. Talk about a bromance, okay? Even after Wilhelm got married and had children, Jakob lived with them. Jakob, who's over on your left, remained a bachelor his entire life. And he was the more obviously, putting it in air quotes, intellectual of the 2, devoting his time exclusively to scholarship and academia. He was a librarian, wrote extensively on the history of the German language, and he even began an all-inclusive German dictionary, and unfortunately was left incomplete when he passed away. And in addition to all of that, he found time to publish important work about the history of law in Northern Europe. Now, Wilhelm, see him over on the right, on the other hand, he was the gregarious, outgoing guy. He's the one who became the devoted husband. He was the father of 4 children. And his work as an anthropologist and a folklorist was really the definite core of his work with his brother Jakob. Together, the 2 brothers traveled throughout Germany and its environs, listening to, reading, and collecting the stories that would end up being the essential reason for their fame today. And it's interesting, 210 tales. That's the core of their work. And that's how we know the Grimm brothers, through those 210 tales. Now, like so many other intellectuals of the period, the rise of a movement called Romanticism during the 18th century had revived an interest in traditional folk stories, which to the Grimms and their colleagues represented a pure form of national literature and culture. Now, that's an important detail. When Aesop, for example, was writing his fables and tales in ancient Greece during the 6th century BCE, he was creating didactic stories meant to entertain and teach. For the Grimm brothers, on the other hand, writing down the stories they collected throughout Germany and neighboring regions was a political act, an act of nationalism. The Grimms didn't want German stories or the German versions of widely known stories to be lost. Now, part of the impetus for this was you have to understand that back in the 19th century, well, at least until the middle of the 19th century, Germany was basically 10, 20 or so, almost like city states. They were regions. There was no unified Germany. And so they had this great fear that all of this rich tradition and all of these various towns and cities and regions was going to be lost. Now, after the middle of the 19th century, then, when there was a unified Germany, their stories and the stories and works of many other artists, composers, and writers became the core of kind of a German sense of art. By the way, this happened in other countries too. This happened in Italy. This happened in France. The rise of Romanticism was also the rise of nationalism. Now, in the course of undertaking this exhaustive work, Jakob and Wilhelm established a methodology for collecting and recording folk stories that actually remains the basis for folklore studies right to this day. So between the first edition of 1812 and the 7th and final edition of 1857, Jakob and Wilhelm revised their collection of folk tales many times, so that over 7 editions, their children's and household tales, here you have the front cover there, grew from 86 stories to 210. And as I say, now on your screen, you can see some of these original editions, all of which feature black and white lithographs and prints. That first edition, by the way, was published in 2 parts, 1812 and 1815. So this is the 1812 edition, the erste Teil, that means the first volume of Kinder- und Hausmärchen, the children's and household tales. And then this one is the 7th edition, the last one in one collected book from 1857. And that's the one that has 210 stories in it. Now, obviously, after 200 years, the Grimm's folk tales have enjoyed enduring popularity. Their work is available in more than 100 languages and has been adapted numerous times by filmmakers, including trailblazing animated films by the Disney studios that are indeed highly sanitized versions of the originals. Sadly, during the 1930s and 40s, the tales were used as German propaganda by the Third Reich, in much the same way that they used the operas of Richard Wagner. Fortunately, later in the 20th century, psychologists such as Carl Jung and Bruno Bettelheim and scholars like Joseph Campbell reaffirmed the value of folklore in spite of the cruelty and violence in the original versions of some of these tales. By the way, it wasn't just Disney who smoothed over the violence and cruelty. Even the Grimms themselves eventually softened some of the gore for varieties of reasons, including their own deep commitment to religious and moral Protestant ideals. Now, once again, if you want to learn more about these amazing men, I've included a detailed timeline of their lives on my website. You may remember seeing that. There's a big timeline there. So that gives you a little background to the Grimm brothers themselves. Now, before we look at 9 specific stories that the Grimms collected, I want to explore for a little bit where their stories fit in. Where do the Grimm brothers fit into this? So I want to explore a little bit by what we mean by myth and legend and folk tale. Let's put in some of the differences. And let's start with myth, which is arguably the earliest kind of storytelling. Well, first off, a myth is a story. It's an account of something, an attempt by someone or a group to explain something. Number 2, all myths are part of an oral tradition. All ancient myths were originally spoken stories. The vast majority created long before there was even a written language. This means that over time, there were constant changes and transformations to these myths. So think of the telephone game that we all played as kids. I tell you something, then you tell it to the next person, and he or she tells it to the next person, and so on. Well, what the last person hears is often quite different from what you first whispered in someone's ear. Well, myths often have a similar history. When these narratives finally got written down, several, sometimes conflicting variations of one story often came into existence. The third thing, most myths take place long ago and often far away. Think of all the creation stories told around the world, or stories about a universal flood. Now, we really don't know who spoke the first versions of myths. Those first speakers, often priests or shamans or soothsayers, are anonymous. And even when these myths eventually got written down, think of the Greek or Roman myths, for example, they eventually get written down. Even those versions often remained anonymous until famous writers like the first century Roman poet Ovid attempted to gather some of these stories into a coherent volume, like Ovid did in his masterpiece, Metamorphoses. How Ovid, though, is different from the Grimm brothers is that he didn't do extensive research the way the Grimm brothers did. He didn't go out into the countryside of Greece and Rome and collect stories. These are stories that he heard, in the local temple, in the Senate in Rome, and from his grandmother, and he just put these down. It's a brilliant, brilliant book, but again, structured a little differently from the Grimm brothers. Now, the principal characters of myths are usually supernatural beings or supernaturally endowed humans. Long before Marvel or DC comic superheroes, there existed the gods, goddesses, and heroes of historic and prehistoric civilizations in Egypt, Greece, Rome, India, the Nordic regions, Japan, and China. Everywhere you look, every long-term culture you study, you will discover myths filled with remarkable beings. Now, our 6th point is that the great importance of myth in ancient times caused them to become the basis very often for religions or cults, which leads us to number 7. Early religions created what are called etiological myths, okay? Myths that explain the cause of things. And one of the great examples would be creation myths. How did the sun come to be created? How did the moon get in the sky? What are the stars? What is the cause of earthquakes or floods? So an etiological myth attempts to explain things. Now, number 8 on my list can't be emphasized enough. Archaeology and anthropology are important to the study of myths. The study of ancient civilizations, their day-to-day lives, and their beliefs help us better understand these ancient narratives. It puts these narratives in context. And finally, number 9, in a nutshell, mythology is an attempt to explain that which cannot be readily explained. It's humankind's first attempt at science. Now, today, of course, we understand that true science is based on fact and empirical evidence, the evidence of fact-finding. So with that said, how is myth different from legend? Well, first of all, in legends, the principal characters are human heroes and heroines. Joan of Arc or Charlemagne or Queen Boudica of the Celts are all human beings rather than demigods or supernatural beings. Second, in legends, there's always a basis in some aspect of real human history, usually in the past. A terrific example of an upgrade from myth to legend happened in the 19th century when a series of archaeologists, including Charles McLaren, Frank Calvert, and Heinrich Schliemann, conclusively discovered the site of the ancient city of Troy. There, I have the little yellow arrow there pointing at Troy. For years, centuries, Troy and the famous war associated with it were considered a fabrication. They were considered a myth. Well, once the ruins were discovered, scholars had to re-examine what they once thought was a myth. And as I say, it got an upgrade to legend. They found there was a historical basis to those ancient stories. Now, as for number 3, legendary figures tend to be drawn from nobility or aristocracy. Though humble origins may figure importantly into the narrative, I've just put the yellow arrow there by Joan of Arc. You see her on the screen there, right? She's a great example, as is the historical figure of Moses. Both were historical figures. They existed. Both had humble beginnings. Both rose in stature. Joan becoming a general leading an army. Moses becoming the prince of Egypt. So there's that humble beginnings aspect sometimes in legends. A fourth characteristic of legends is that they're usually full of hyperbole, meaning exaggerations. For example, the medieval epic poem about Charlemagne and his kingdom, called The Song of Roland, extols the monarch who has, and I quote, sat gloriously on the throne for 200 years, unquote. Well, such exaggerations serve the purpose of showing the importance of the hero. Finally, I'd like to say this. Legends are an attempt to create a historical basis for something or someone, an attempt to create history for a group. So if myths is an early form of science, legends are an early form of history. What is the history of our town, our village, or our country, or who was the founder of our nation? Now, all of these things did interest the Grimm brothers. And indeed, they certainly did research into myths and legends. But they became primarily interested in folk tales, fairy tales, and fables. So here you are on that page. Now, what's the difference among these names? Though most laypersons tend to use the terms interchangeably, some scholars might argue subtleties. A folk tale tends to deal with ordinary people relying on their human abilities. A fairy tale usually has, well, fairies or other supernatural agencies like elves and pixies or leprechauns or gnomes. And a fable often has a moral message to it. When you read an Aesop fable, they almost all of them end, and the moral of our story is, right? There's a moral message there. But again, for our purposes, the distinctions are subtle. First and foremost, we should remember that these stories, just like legends, just like myths, always start out in an oral form before being written down. I mean, think of the campfire story, you know. Secondly, almost all of these stories deal with ordinary people. And the once there was a king or the once there was a princess stories still tend to deal with the basic ordinary human emotions than necessarily their country or how did they become king or whatever. They tend to be more focused on the emotional aspects. Now, there's also a special branch of folk tales in which animals become the main characters. And those animals are almost always stand-ins for human beings. Now, the traditional name for these narratives is beast fables. I've highlighted that here for you, beast fables. Again, think of Aesop fables. Almost all of them are animals, right? They're all stand-ins for humans. And in our own time, a literary folk tale is George Orwell's Animal Farm, right? They're all great examples. Now, these stories often show ordinary people interacting with nobility, monsters, or supernatural powers, which could include God. And another thing to remember is that these stories were meant to entertain or to teach or to teach, and they often were used to justify customary patterns of behavior. So take Little Red Riding Hood, for example. What's the lesson there? Well, it illustrates what happens when you fail to heed a warning. And Cinderella shows what happens if you remain pure and good, as opposed to behaving like those evil stepsisters. So when you are speaking about Aesop or the anonymous writers of the 1001 Nights or the Grimm Brothers, you are speaking about writers who wrote down previously known stories. Okay. But, and this is letter D, starting in the late Renaissance, you see the development of what's called the literary fairy tale. So writers like Charles Perrault, Hans Christian Andersen, Lewis Carroll, L. Frank Baum, right? I put on your screen there, right? There were 14 Wizard of Oz books. Those are examples of literary fairy tales. They are not based on previously existing materials. Folklorist Jan Yolen, and I'll be quoting her a few times today. She's really one of the major experts in this field. Jane Yolen says, basically, there are three kinds of folk tales: the oral, the transcribed, and the literary tale. Now, number 6 is key to a good fairy tale. The main characters often have to overcome great obstacles. And in many cases, they must undertake what Joseph Campbell calls the hero's journey, a journey for a protagonist that goes from some kind of personal misfortune to some kind of redemption. And finally, as scholars like Carl Jung show us, folk and fairy tales are usually filled with archetypes: the abused child, the evil stepmother, the witch, the Cinderella type, the underdog, the outcast, to name just a few. Now, before we move on, it's important to realize that the lines among these three categories are not solid. Some myths have fairy tale elements, such as when the enchantress Circe transforms Odysseus's crew into a herd of pigs in the Odyssey. It's actually one of the funniest moments in ancient literature. All these former soldiers oinking around the palace. It's hysterical. Some legends have mythical elements. For example, most medieval legends have a strong emphasis on divine intervention. And Greek epics like the Iliad have legendary humans like Priam and the king of Troy, who is the king of Troy, and Odysseus, who is the leader of the Greek army, interacting with gods and goddesses, as seen in the story of the Trojan horse. Again, I just put an arrow up for that. I mean, that's one of the most famous stories of ancient literature. Probably a fabrication, but we know the battle was real. So again, legend, but maybe mixed with other elements there. And in some fairy tales, well, they have mythic and legendary aspects to them. Probably one of the great recent examples, and this is a literary fairy tale, is the film Field of Dreams. It's a classic example of mixed genres. For those of you, right, to refresh our memories, right? It's a story filled with real life baseball legends who miraculously return as enchanted ghosts. If you build it, they will come. I mean, that mixes everything. And so you do find when you read the Grimm brothers that there are sometimes little mythic elements, there are little legendary elements to it, even when they're basically writing about the common people, okay? Folktale. So with that said, let's look at 9 famous Grimm stories. Now, I will assume that most people are familiar with these tales, but again, in case you're not, you will find links to detailed summaries of each story, as well as links to the complete text on my website, makingwings.net. And again, it's deeper dive number 9. Now, in addition, I also provide you with links to background resources for each of the 9 stories. I was sharing with Linda earlier that I have given this presentation a couple of times this month. And at least one person had said, thank you so much. I know these stories, but I only know them through the kind of watered down versions that, later cartoonists and animated features, made out of them. So, thank you for putting down the actual text, because I think what you're going to find is that the originals in the Grimm, this ain't what you grew up with. It wasn't the Golden Book version. So let's begin. And we're going to begin with Rapunzel. By the way, if you actually do want a very fine Disneyfied version of it, the movie Tangled that came out a few years ago, pretty faithful, but it does leave out some aspects, and we're going to get into those. It's the story of a girl trapped in a tower by a wicked sorceress. The girl eventually escapes, but in a great plot twist, ends up rescuing her rescuer. Let me explain. So the Grimm's immediate source for Rapunzel was a story published by Frederick Schultz in 1790. The brothers rightly saw in Schultz's printed story a tale with a previously long and widespread oral tradition. Now, for each of the stories we're looking at today, I want to focus on a few key aspects. So for Rapunzel, let's continue with this idea that I had mentioned earlier. According to Jungian psychologists, there are 7 key feminine archetypes: the mother, the maiden, the queen, the huntress, the wise woman, the mystic, and the lover, and a host of subtypes that grow out from these. For Carl Jung, Rapunzel is an example of the maiden archetype. She is helpless or powerless in some way. The maiden type, and certainly this is true of Rapunzel, is often imprisoned physically, and in many ways she's imprisoned psychologically. So like other maidens, Rapunzel has been wronged by a villain, in this case a wicked enchantress, and a hero comes along to avenge that wrong on the maiden's behalf. Now, many psychologists and scholars, and here I'm really talking about contemporary psychologists and scholars, also see Rapunzel's imprisonment as an example of the woman in the tower archetype. She's literally trapped in a phallus and must escape to become her fully female self. But this story also contains another aspect of many folk and fairy tales, especially those written in the Romantic era of the early and mid-19th century. And that is to present the woman as a healer, the woman as salvation, or the woman as the divine feminine. And from there, it's only a short step for the Roman Catholic Church in 1849, at the pinnacle of the Romantic period, to declare a woman named Mary as the Immaculate Mother of God, who was herself immaculately conceived. Now, we clearly see the image of the woman as healer, the woman as savior at the end of the Rapunzel story. And here is that end, which I have put up on your screen. And I've highlighted a few things in yellow, but you can follow along if you'd like. This is the ending as it appears in the Grimm Brothers. The prince was overcome with grief, and in his despair, he threw himself out of the tower, from the tower. He escaped with his life, but the thorns into which he fell poked out his eyes. Blind, he wandered about in the forest, eating nothing but grass and roots, and doing nothing but weeping and wailing over the loss of his beloved wife, Rapunzel. Thus he wandered about miserably for some years, finally happening into the wilderness where Rapunzel lived miserably with the twins that she had given birth to. He heard a voice and thought it was familiar. He advanced towards it, and as he approached, Rapunzel recognized him and, crying, threw her arms around his neck. Two of her tears fell into his eyes, and they became clear once again, and he could see as well as before. He led her into his kingdom, where he was received with joy, and for a long time they lived happily and satisfied. Okay. Yeah, okay, but isn't there a little bit of a mixed message there, right? The maiden Rapunzel, once trapped in a tower and a single mom, thanks to the king's earlier visitations, is now a mature woman savior who heals the king. Okay, cool. But it's the king who provides her ever after home. Now, some may argue that she's right back in the tower again, just not a literal one. Now, such feminist readings of these texts are very much part of 21st century literary criticism, which brings us to a point that the folklore scholar Jane Yolen makes in her introduction to favorite folk tales from around the world. And she says, many tales owe their settings, their archetypal characters, even bits of their magic to the past, but thematically, they draw upon the century and the place in which they are written, because authors are as deeply rooted in their society as the readers or listeners are. So the 1812 version of Rapunzel, which you just read, is as much a piece of romantic literature as the original created at some point in the previous century. And the woman in the tower interpretation of the story that is a reading very much a product of late 20th and early 21st century, well, that's a modern reading of it. And that's what makes these folk tales so wonderful. They're timeless, and they speak to every generation across time. Next up, Hansel and Gretel, the story of a cruel mother, a lackluster father, a witch with a talent for baking, and two children who managed to outsmart the chef. Now, though Jacob and Wilhelm credited various tales from Hesse, the reason where they lived, as their source, scholars have argued that the brothers heard the story in 1809 from the family of Wilhelm's friend and future wife, Thierfelder. We would say wild in German to be wild, and partly from other sources. Now, according to folklorist Jack Sipes, the tale actually emerged in the late Middle Ages, somewhere between 1250 and 1500. And just shortly after that period, a close written variant like Martin Montanus's Gartengesellschaft, which was published in 1590, began to appear. And scholar Christine Goldberg argues that the episode of the paths marked with stones and crumbs, well, that already can be found in 17th century French tales. And it represents an elaboration of the motif of the thread of, from ancient Greece, Ariadne, when she gives Theseus, so that he can escape, a thread so that he can escape from the Minoan labyrinth. Further, a house made of confectionery is also found in a 14th century British manuscript about the land of Cockaigne. So my point here, giving you all of this, the dumping all of this on your screen, is to say that the Grimm brothers, yes, while drawing on one or two specific sources that they found in Germany, there's actually a long tradition to Hansel and Gretel, and many aspects of that story that literally go back to ancient Greece and Rome. Well, in his trailblazing book, The Uses of Enchantment, eminent psychologist Bruno Bedelheim, my students used to call him Brutal Bedelheim, because sometimes he really dives into things. Bruno Bedelheim suggests several key fairy and folktale topics. And some of these are clearly present in Hansel and Gretel. Thrust out of their home by their mother, both children clearly suffer from separation anxiety. What Bedelheim calls starvation fear, well, that's at the core of the tale. The struggle for independence is plainly represented by the attempts to break free of the forest witch. Even the theme of sibling rivalry is subtly present, with both the sister and the brother vying for solutions to their dilemma. Puberty in this story is not so much a sexual one like we saw in Rapunzel, as it is a growing up experience about wisdom and stature. And finally, folktales often take place in dark and dangerous locations like forests or caves or dungeons. Well, in this case, it's the forest, right? We have to remember that until the urban age is in full swing, the forest surrounding your village was quite literally a place of lions and tigers and bears. Oh my. Now, a powerful theme that you find in many folktales is that of children lacking one or more parents, frequently involving the introduction of the wicked stepmother archetype. And in this case, the story, the loss actually occurs at the end rather than the more typical beginning. And we'll get to that in a moment. Folklorist Jack Zipes in The Golden Age of Folk and Fairy Tales argues that the importance of Hansel and Gretel in the European oral and literary tradition may be explained by the continually used theme of child abandonment and abuse. Due to famines and lack of birth control, it wasn't uncommon in medieval Europe to abandon unwanted children in front of churches or in the forest. Further, the death of a mother during childbirth sometimes led to tensions after remarriage, and Zipes proposes that it may have played a role in the emergence of the motif of the hostile stepmother. Now, you can see this so-called loss of the mother theme in the ending of the 1857 Grimm version, which I placed over there on the left of your screen. And again, note the yellow highlighting. You can follow along. And finally, they saw the father's house in the distance. They began to run, rushed inside, and threw their arms around their father's neck. The man had not had even one happy hour since the children were left in the woods. However, the woman had died. Gretel shook out her apron, scattering pearls and precious stones around the room, and Hansel added to them by throwing one handful after the other from his pockets. Now, all their cares were at an end, and they lived happily together, sometimes translated, and they lived happily ever after. Well, what you have on your screen is the ending in 1857, which represents a very substantial alteration of earlier versions of the text. In the first printed edition of 1812, the woodcutter's wife is identified unambiguously and repeatedly as the mother. However, with the fourth edition in 1840, the Grimms introduced the word stepmother, although they did retain the word mother in some passages. The Grimm's final version in 1857, that's the one you see here, refers to the woodcutter's wife once as the stepmother, twice as the mother and about a dozen times generically simply as the woman. And notice how this is just stuck right in there. The man didn't have a happy hour since the children had been left in the woods. However, the woman had died. And that, however, it kind of indicates, well, thank goodness she's gone, because now he can really, that was why he was unhappy before him. But now that she's gone, he could be happy. Okay. The woman who sent the children into the forest isn't really worthy of being called a mother anymore. She becomes an anonymous character, the woman, who's literally written out of the story. Well, on a happier note is the very clever, valiant little tailor, and also known as the brave little tailor. It's a tale that revolves around a lie that's perpetuated to great advantage by an extremely cunning fellow. The Brothers Grimm published this tale in the first edition of Children's and Household Tales in 1812. It was based on various oral traditions and printed sources, including Der Wegkreuzer, which is the shorter way, first published in 1557 by Martinus Montanus. A version of this tale was also included in the original manuscript that they were writing down in 1810, but it appears in all published editions of the collection. All 7 editions has this story. But as was the case with many of their tales, the Grimms, primarily Wilhelm, substantially changed the tale, starting with the second edition of 1819, by adding several key episodes. But what we find in all 7 editions of the Grimm Brothers anthology is a consistent presentation of the 3 main characters. Our first character, of course, is the tailor. And in this illustration, you see him up in the tree, about to drop a rock on the giant's head. And you may remember the giant accuses his brother, who's sleeping, of doing that, right? Well, our tailor, right? He's clever, he's intelligent, he's confident. When people hear that he has killed 7 with 1 blow, they think he had the strength to kill 7 people. Well, of course, the line refers to the fact, quite hilariously, that what actually happened was that he killed 7 houseflies with 1 swat. But he lets the misinterpretation perpetuate to his advantage. He uses misdirection and other cunning to trick the other characters, including various forms of psychological manipulation to influence the behaviors of others, such as, again, that illustration of turning a pair of giants against each other and playing on people's assumptions and fears. Similarly, he uses decoy tactics to lure both a unicorn and a wild boar into his traps and to avoid being killed in the first giant's bed. This reliance on trickery and manipulation by the protagonist is a feature that we will eventually find in later literature as the anti-hero archetype. Now, our second main character is the king. Well, he's very mistrusting and judgmental. He uses the promise of giving away half the kingdom to persuade the tailor to take on seemingly deadly tasks, because he's too lazy to do it himself most of the time. The king is one-dimensional as a character and is essentially a plot device. He's the source of the challenges for the protagonist to overcome to achieve a desired goal. This is a very watered-down version of the 12 Labors of Hercules, if you want to think of it that way, that great myth about Hercules. And the king keeps sending him out on all of these different missions. This is kind of a folk version of that. And then finally, the third main character, the princess. Well, what about her? Well, on the one hand, she's the prize for the tailor in completing all of the challenges. If he accomplishes them, he gets to marry the princess, and along with it, gets half of the kingdom. Unfortunately, on the other hand, she sets great store on the social class of people. So when she finds out that the person she's married to is no more than a poor tailor, well, she's furious and tries to have him killed. Now, her self-absorbed vindictiveness and its easy defeat is considered is consistent, I should say, with the stock character of the shrewish bride. Think Shakespeare's play, The Taming of the Shrew. She's also indicative of a theme you've probably noticed by this point, namely that women as a whole, they don't often come off very well in many folk and fairy tales. There's a definite misogynistic streak in many of these stories. Women are either weak and need rescuing, by a man, of course, or, like the princess in this narrative, are petty and shallow, or in the case of many others, especially the stepmothers, well, they're vindictive and cruel or outright dangerous. Well, speaking of stepmothers and stepsisters and misogyny and cruelty and that's our next story, Cinderella, known to German-speaking readers as Aschenputtel. The primary source for the Grimm Brothers text came from an oral version given to them by Dorothea Weimann and other oral sources. This tale was included in the first edition of Children's and Household Tales in 1812, but was substantially revised for the second edition of 1819. And it's that version that then maintains through all the remaining editions right up to 1857. Now, this is a much more violent version than the equally famous 18th century French version of Charles Perrault, and certainly far different from any Disney or Rodgers and Hammerstein variation. In the 1819 and subsequent Grimm versions, Cinderella's father has not died, and the two stepsisters mutilate their feet to fit in the golden slipper. There's no glass slipper in Grimm. Further, there's also no fairy godmother in the Grimm Brothers version. Rather, help comes from some beneficent pigeons and a wishing tree that the heroine planted on her deceased mother's grave when she recites a chant. And you can see over here the illustration on your left. There's the tree and there are the pigeons. So there's no fairy godmother in the Grimm Brothers. And in the 1819 edition of their collection, the brothers supplemented the original 1812 ending with a coda, another couple of lines, in which the two stepsisters, for their cruelty, suffer a bloody and terrible punishment by the Princess Cinderella. The sisters are blinded by birds at Cinderella's wedding. The story ends with this line: and thus, for their wickedness and falsehood, they were punished with blindness for as long as they lived. Imagine reading that to your kid. Have a good night, honey. So again, this is the Grimm Brothers version, and this is not Disney. Now, this familiar story has been told in 100 different ways and understood in 100 and understood in 100 different ways. It's been told and understood differently across the world. And yet, as Jane Yolen reminds us, no two readers or listeners hear exactly the same tale. Each person brings something of him or herself to the story, and the story is then recreated between the teller and the listener, between the writer and the reader. Further, many old tales like that of Cinderella, which can trace its roots back to ancient China, carry with them over the miles and through the generations the bruises, blandishments, and embraces of the societies in which they have dwelled. So in that sense, then, stories like Cinderella are really a part of world history. And I put on your page here, there's an African version that's quite beautiful. Here's one from India. Here's one from China, which is actually the oldest version of the story. And of course, in the background, I couldn't resist putting Cinderella's castle from Disneyland here. Now, our next tale, Little Red Riding Hood, is, of course, the well-known story about a girl who doesn't listen to her mother and a big bad wolf with a voracious appetite. Its origins can be traced back to the 17th century to several European folktales, including one from Italy called The False Grandmother. The best known versions beside the Grimm Brothers tale was published by Charles Perrault in 1697. Now, the Grimm Brothers source for the story was Jeanette and Marie Hassenpflug. They were sisters. In the Perrault and earlier editions of the Grimm Brothers anthology, there is no happy ending. A village girl is deceived into giving a wolf she encounters information that he needs to find her grandmother's house successfully and eat the old woman, while at the same time avoiding being noticed by woodcutters working in the nearby forest. Then he proceeds to lay a trap for Red Riding Hood. Little Red Riding Hood ends up being asked to climb into the bed. And trust me, there are a lot of interpretations of that one. Crawls up into the bed before she is also eaten by the wolf. And this is where the story ends in the Grimm Brothers original version and in many other versions. The wolf emerges the victor of the encounter. And why? Because Little Riding Hood didn't listen to her mommy. However, in later editions of the Grimm anthology, the story concludes victoriously. A hunter comes to the rescue with an axe and cuts open the sleeping wolf. Little Red Riding Hood and her grandmother emerge shaken but unharmed. Then they all of them fill the wolf's body with heavy stones. When the wolf awakens and attempts to flee, the stones cause him to collapse and to die. Well, the conclusion appears on your screen. Then all three were delighted. The huntsman drew off the wolf's skin and went home with it. The grandmother ate the cake and drank the wine which Little Red Riding Hood had brought. But Little Red Riding Hood thought to herself, as long as I live, I will never by myself leave the path to run into the wood when my mother has forbidden me to do so. So there's kind of a happy ending. Now, the tale makes the clearest contrast between the safe world of the village and the dangers of the forest. And it also warns about the dangers of not obeying one's parents. If only Riding Hood had listened to the warnings of her mother, she never would have met up with any calamity to begin with. Our sixth tale is Godfather Death. In it, a man seeks a godfather to protect and look over his newborn child. He meets up with a few people, including God, the devil, and death. Well, he doesn't pick God and he doesn't pick the devil, but he just chooses death. And why? Because death sees every person equally without any judgment. Well, that little child grows up to be a very famous doctor. But when he attempts at the end of the story to trick his godfather, death has the last word and the doctor dies. Now, the immediate source of the story was an oral version attributed to Marie Wilde. The tale was included in the first edition of the anthology. However, in the first edition of the story, in that version, the physician remains alive. But in the 1819 version and forward, death pretends to help the doctor, but fails on purpose and therefore kills the physician. You can't outrun death. Now, the folklorist Max Luthi says that every type of fairy tale portrays events which can safely be interpreted as images for psychological and cosmic processes. And what is more basic, more psychological, more cosmic than that most ultimate of all cycles, the beauty of birth and the inevitability of death, which J.K. Rowling adapts brilliantly in her 7 Harry Potter novels, which are classic examples, by the way, of the literary fairy tale. If you've watched the 8 Harry Potter films, right, there's 7 books, but 8 films, you may recognize this back scene from the Deathly Hallows, the film number 7. Folk and fairy tales like Godfather Death are, which is a variation, by the way, of that story by Grimm. So folk and fairy tales like Godfather Death are an archetypal form of literature which help lay the groundwork for all literature and art. Now, I could easily argue that the bulk of all literature and art that's ever been created deals with the beginnings of things, the middles of things, and the inevitable ending of things. a life, a job, a romance, a friendship, and they're all about that basic cycle. And that brings us to Sleeping Beauty, with a princess, a very pissed off sorceress, a hunky prince, and a heavy dose of narcolepsy. It remains one of the Grimm brothers' most favorite and famous tales. Now, most everyone, thanks to Tchaikovsky's great ballet and the 1959 Disney animated feature, my God, the cruel witch in that one, I scared the bejesus out of me when I first saw it. I was like it was like 8 years old when I saw Sleeping Beauty in 1959. I couldn't sleep for nights anyway. But anyway, everyone knows through that movie and through the great ballet, they know the tale of the scorned witch who curses the beautiful Princess Aurora. But there are fascinating variations that go back to the medieval period. One of the most famous earlier examples of Sleeping Beauty and the Sleeping Beauty archetype is in the medieval courtly romance Perceforest, published in 1528. Now, in this version, a princess named Zelandine falls in love with a man named Troilus. Her father sends him to perform tasks to prove himself worthy of her, and while he's gone, Zelandine falls into an enchanted sleep. Troilus finds her and impregnates her while she's still asleep. When their child is born, the child is the one who draws from her finger, the flax that caused her to sleep. Well, she realizes from the ring that Troilus left her that he was the father, and Troilus later returns to marry her. There's a second part of the tale, too, in which the princess and her children are almost put to death, but instead are hidden, and they are saved, and Troilus comes to the rescue. Well, I simply can't imagine in this day and age of Me Too that this Zelandine version of the story, or the Rapunzel story we spoke of earlier for that matter, would even be remotely acceptable today. But in their days, Zelandine and the Rapunzel folktales, among others like them, were quite popular, and people didn't seem to object, at least openly, to a story about a vulnerable woman being taken advantage of sexually, especially since the man, quote unquote, did the right thing. Even earlier influences for the Sleeping Beauty story come from the narratives about sleeping Brunhilde in Germanic sagas, and the tribulations of saintly female martyrs in the early Christian stories. The brothers added a variant to their version of the story. Their version ends when the prince arrives to awaken Sleeping Beauty. Now, in the Grimm brothers, her name is Rosamund, not Aurora. And they, of course, live happily ever after. Now, variants of this folktale have found their way around the world, changed and transformed to suit the society in which they emerge. Studying this story and its various international and cultural incarnations allows us to understand the psychology of other people and ourselves. Carl Jung, Joseph Campbell, and Marie von Franz focus on the common archetypes that we find in these stories from around the world. Freudian scientists like Bruno Bedelheim in The Uses of Enchantment said that folktales were not only a record of emotions carried through centuries, but were actually part of the child's rehearsals for adult life, which is why fairy stories and folktales ring so true for adult hearers, viewers, and readers. So no matter what version of Sleeping Beauty you read, as children, we see life lessons. But as adults, we recognize ourselves, our hopes, our fears, our innermost feelings. And that brings us to Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, a story of a jealous stepmother, a huntsman, a prince, dwarves, and a pubescent young girl who comes to sexual and emotional maturity in the end. Now, the Grimm's source was once again Marie Hassenpflug, as well as other informants. They published it in their first edition of the stories, numbered as Tale 53. And the Grimms kept revising it actually until their 1854 edition, the sixth edition, and then That was republished in 1857. Well, Snow White features some of the most often used archetypes in myth, legend, and folklore. There's a mirror. You know that one from the story of Narcissus. There's the poisoned or forbidden fruit. You see that in the biblical tale of Eve. There's a coffin. Well, let's think Dracula. And of course, there's the evil queen. Well, she's the ultimate stepmother archetype. And it's the evil queen in Snow White who becomes one of the most remarkable villains in all folk literature. She makes Lady Macbeth look like Rebecca of Sunnybrook Farm. Yet, true to the Grimm brothers' ever-growing pious spirituality, they made sure that she was also punished for her horrible deeds. And that punishment, in their minds, makes it a happy ending. Okay? Indeed, she comes to a rather horrific end. Well, the final section of the story is on your screen. Snow White's godless stepmother was also invited to the wedding feast. After putting on her beautiful clothes, she stepped before her mirror and said, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who in this land is fairest of all?" The mirror answered, "Oh, you, my queen, are fair, it is true, but the young queen is 1,000 times fairer than you." Well, the wicked woman uttered a curse, and she became so frightened that she did not know what to do. At first, she did not want to go to the wedding, but she found no peace, so she had to go to see this young queen. And when she arrived, she recognized Snow White, and terrorized, she could only stand there without moving. Then they put on a pair of then put a pair of iron shoes into burning coals. They were brought forth with tongs and placed before her, and she was forced to step into the red hot shoes and dance until she fell down dead. I really do think that we can agree that this is not something that you would read as a bedtime story to a small child. But perhaps in the Romantic era, yes, you would, because children had to be taught that there is punishment for evil. So you better be good, because that's what God wants of you. And finally, last but not least, we have our 9th tale, number 55 in the 1812 edition and in every other edition. It's Rumpelstiltskin. It's the story of a young woman who's taken advantage of by both a king and a dwarf, and if you really want to say, her father too, but she comes out victorious in the end. The Grimm source was primarily Henrietta Wild, also known as Dorchen, who would become Wilhelm Grimm's wife in 1825. In the 1812 edition of the Brothers Grimm tales, Rumpelstiltskin, at the very end of the story, simply ran away angrily and never came back. Well, the ending was revised in an 1857 edition to a more gruesome ending, wherein Rumpelstiltskin tore himself in two. Other versions have Rumpelstiltskin driving his right foot so far into the ground that he creates a chasm and falls into it, never to be seen again. And in the oral version, originally collected by the Brothers Grimm, Rumpelstiltskin flies out of the window on a cooking ladle, much like a witch flies on a broom. Well, the ending of the 1857 version of the tale is one of the great metaphors about unbridled anger, and I put it up on the screen for you. "The devil told you that! The devil told you that!" shouted the little man, and in his anger, he stomped his right foot so hard into the ground that he fell in up to his waist. And then in a rage, he pulled at his left leg so hard with both hands that he ripped himself in two. What a great metaphor about the psychological cost of anger and rage. You know, we have an expression in our language today, don't we, that I believe has its source in this story, when we say that anger ripped us apart, or that event ripped ourselves apart. Well, that's where it comes from. It's in Rumpelstiltskin. Well, once the miller's daughter, who by marriage is now queen of the land, learns Rumpelstiltskin's name, and again by great trickery, she has authority over him. The value and power of using personal names and titles is well established in psychology, management, teaching, and trial law. In fact, today, it is often referred to as the Rumpelstiltskin principle. But above and beyond that, it is through the queen's own intelligence that she is able to win in the end. Now, unlike other fairy tale women who need men to rescue them, the miller's daughter is very much her own hero. For me, this story is one of the few narratives in the collection that I could argue illustrates a victory over misogyny. But of course, that opinion is surely rooted in my 21st century sensibility. Remember, I'm reading it as a man living in the 21st century. Such a feminist reading probably would not have been the norm in the early 19th century when this story was first put down. So as we move to our conclusion, I'd love to leave you with this quote from Jane Yolen. She says that tales are meant to be told. This simple statement is correct both in the etymological sense, tale comes from the Anglo-Saxon word talu, which means speech, and in a historical sense. Storytelling, the oldest of the arts, has always been both an entertainment and a cultural necessity. And I would expand that a bit more to note that Joseph Campbell makes a similar point when he asserts that myths and legends about life and death, about our societal heritage, and about the nature around us are necessary to give us a sense of reason and purpose. Before there was science, there was myth. Before there was the formal study of history, there was legend. And for me, I would add that before there was psychology and sociology, there were folk tales. So there you have it, an overview of Wilhelm and Jacob's lives, a quick look at what we mean by myths, legends, and folk tales, and some thoughts about 9 of the brothers' most famous stories. Again, you could do a deeper dive into all of these topics by going to my website, makingwings.net. It's deeper dive number 9. And I'm going to squeeze in one more Jane Yolen quote. I love this. Storytelling is a personal art that makes public what is private and makes private what is public. And now it's time for your thoughts and ideas. So if anybody has a question or wants to say anything.
Well, thank you very much, Bill. That was interesting. And especially when you said, I did a lot of children's literature, how many different versions there are of Cinderella and how many of these different tales were around the entire world before there was communication behind the world. So again, all these themes really did take place and were able to continue. It, like you said, it became their history, but the same tales of the human nature continue,
Oh, yeah.
no matter where you were, they still want to tell the same stories.
Right. And that is an important point. Thank you for saying that, because I want to bring that out too. And we go back to Carl Jung. He talked about the collective unconscious. And what he meant by that is that you would have stories, and take Cinderella. They appear all over the world, and in many cases, totally independently. So, a person from China wasn't talking to the Grimm brothers, So there must be something in those stories that resonates so deeply with the human spirit that we create these stories. Every culture has a creation story. Every single culture, major culture around the planet, from Aboriginal Australia to the Nordic countries to the indigenous people of North and South America, have flood stories. Well, they weren't talking to each other, and yet the details are so similar. There's a boat, there's an ark, there's a Noah character, there's the animals, there's sending a dove. In some stories it's a raven, in some stories it's an eagle, but they're all the same, and they weren't communicating with each other. But there's something hardwired into us to want to tell these stories. So thank you for saying that, because I think that's a really fascinating part. That yes, we read the Grimm brothers and we know the Grimm brothers mainly through other versions, but they're not, these stories are worldwide, many of them.
Well, and it's hard to, I know you're sitting there talking to you a little bit about, and please, if anybody that's listening wants to unmute themselves,
Oh,
please just
yeah,
unmute
join
yourself
in.
and chime in.
Coffee
But
crunch.
it's like I've said this too. It's you can't put, sometimes you can't put our eyes, our 21st century eyes onto what was going through them, because
Absolutely.
the dangers that were facing children, and again, just simply just making it to adulthood was not, their fears were real. They could be real. Like you said, there really were lions in that forest, and nobody was going to come. You didn't have a cell phone to call somebody and say you were lost. You had to
911.
not get lost.
Exactly. No GPS to get you through the forest.
Exactly. It's like, don't get lost because we don't think we can find you. So again, maybe a little scarier, but maybe there were some reasons behind it, and I'm happy that I got the watered down Disney version. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, absolutely. It's
Could
very
you,
interesting in some literary tales that are being written today. The forest or the jungle, in some versions, you think of the Rudyard Kipling stories. The jungle replaces the traditional European forest. Now several modern fairy tales, the literary fairy tales, are replacing that with urban settings, slums and dangerous alleyways and things like that. Certainly Charles Dickens made a field day out of that. Think of Oliver Twist. I mean, there you got, in so many ways, that story is a fairy tale. And where does it take place? In the slums of London, the East End. I see Michelle, I think, wanted to say something.
yes, I was going to say, do you think because of technology and everything that will interfere with the creative thought process of bringing these stories in new iterations?
No, I just think it'll be different from how I think it'll just be different. I'm gonna leave it, that thought, that today with all the technology we have, have you ever seen the movie, any of the Matrix movies? There's a great example.
Okay, yes, I have.
Yeah, I mean, where there's something, this deep, dark warning. Instead of a forest, it's the deep, dark warning against technology. Technology are the brambled bushes that we have to climb through, probably one of the most remarkable fairy tales, literary fairy tales of recent years, is Steven Spielberg's movie AI, Artificial Intelligence. It's absolutely, it's a tearjerker, but I mean, it's got everything, and it's got the forest, and it's got the technology, and it's got the warnings, So as we progress, the forest will become a new thing. The stepmother will become a new thing.
Okay.
But we'll be able to trace it. We can trace, the mafia boss and some, store, Scarface is just a variation on, the evil ogre, let's say. I'm making that up, but you know what I'm saying. So with each successive age, we're going to keep certain types, but we're just going to dress them differently.
Okay. I can go with that.
Yeah, I think that's, on the drop of a hat, I think that could be the fairest answer, but if anybody else wants to elaborate, please. Do we have anybody else?
Yeah, there was a show, and it was based on a series of books. I can't remember what that was, but it was talking about, it was about the gods and how the gods of old were kind of getting replaced by the gods of new. And as you were saying, AI or social media becoming now what the new thing that people are now worshiping, and were they replacing the old Nordic gods and stuff. As you say, it always kind of, same themes can evolve into different
absolutely.
manner,
I mean,
embodiment.
I've been, I don't know if you've been watching it. I binge watched the new Lord of the Rings series, the Rings of Power, and of course, if you know the rest of the story, from the Lord of the Rings movies or the books, I mean, that happens there too. The elves finally have to go off, into a land where they, they'll be remembered, but they're no longer because there's no need for them anymore. They've kind of outgrown their purpose, So that theme, of and the gods being, the contemporary movie, I think we're up to 4 movies now, the Marvel Comics Thor movies very much make that, that the gods and goddesses are around today, but they die off because they're not needed anymore. They pass away, and clearly the character of Thor, I mean, he's so out of place, in this modern world in which he finds himself. And of course, Chris Hemsworth does it so humorously in many ways, like what's going on here, So that is another theme, this replacement theme that you bring up, I think is a very important one. And I think that you're going to find more and more, of that. But, look at this conversation we're having. I mean, out of a simple fairy tale,
Yeah.
comes all of this thought, that, and whether you're an adult or a child, we love our stories, adults go to see, Encanto and Coco and Tangled, and the kids may not get all of the adult humor in it, but we adults certainly do, and so modern contemporary tellings of these older stories, while they may be somewhat sanitized in some cases, also have messages for us as well as, the kids. Don't tell Bruno, no, no, no.
Well,
Which,
I
by the
think
way,
that
was
that
one of
was
my funny.
yeah, that was it, because that I do actually love that movie.
Oh, me too. I love that film. But could you
Well,
not argue that that is a fairy tale, but also has kind of mythic elements with the supernatural, and it has legendary elements because it actually revolves around actual historical things, like pinatas and certain celebrations and so forth. So it has all three, and it's all kind of interwoven. We could have a field day. We could do 7 more of these, right?
Well, I would like to thank you very much for coming. This really was very entertaining, and for everyone that did come, as I said, I will be posting this to YouTube. I will send up a follow-up email to everybody that registered with the link to the YouTube. I will also do a link to that page of yours, and I will go look and see if in our buckle system, which ones of these books are available or not available. So
Sounds great.
I'll wait for the YouTube link either tomorrow or Friday. I will send out a follow-up email. But I'd like to thank you very much, Bill. This was very enjoyable.
Oh,
Now
thank
we'll
you,
all look
Linda,
at our
for
Halloween
inviting.
costumes a little differently, maybe.
Yeah, exactly. How historical they are. Maybe next year, if you'd like me back, I have a presentation that I do called The Haunted History of Halloween, and I trace it all the way back to ancient times to the present. So maybe next year we could do the see you next year.
Absolutely. All Hallows Eve. It's an interesting tale, how we're hiding amongst the real ghosts, right?
Yeah, right. Exactly. Thank you so much for inviting me. It was a pleasure to speak to you people tonight. Thank you for being here. I appreciate it. And be well and have beautiful holidays.
Yes, thank you very much, everyone.